Well, Andrew Herscher has already remarked in his introduction in an almost millennial fashion on the last of the last of the last. And here I am, the last of the last of the last. And not only that, I am, I believe, by a considerable margin, the oldest participant in this event. A circumstance which prompts me to ponder from time to time the prospective circumstances of my death. And this room, on which Mark Foster Gage has already remarked in his presentation yesterday, has caused me to suppose, or at least it has caused me rendered me unable to entirely suppress the idea that a bolt of lightning may come down from the oculus above us and strike me dead on the spot. So I ask Moderator Herscher in advance, in the event that this should transpire during my presentation, that I would call upon him to extend my thanks beyond Dean Ponce de Leon, Chairman McMorrow, and the formidable administrative staff of the Taubman College. So delegated. The second kind of preliminary remark I will make goes to the effect that I don't actually think, interestingly enough, I don't think I'm going to pick any big fights here with either Yves Blau or Wes Jones. And in fact, I might thank Wes for having already taken on the role of curmudgeon, a role I had anticipated being obliged to play myself. Here we go. Andrew Herscher's brief to the members of our panel has brought back to me a memory of conversation with an academic colleague of mine of long standing. Some of you will, of course, know him, Dean Ralph Lerner, first Princeton and then Hong Kong. More than once in conversations with me, Lerner opined that one of the things every architecture school curriculum needs is a course describing the architectural history of the past 15 years. To be sure, those of you that know Lerner will know that he has a sardonic demeanor, which makes it difficult to tell exactly how serious he is in some of his more provocative statements. Still, I have to confess that his wry proposition has remained lodged in my mind until now, despite the fact that I can't point to a single example of a school that has introduced such a course. I suppose that Rafael Meneo's well-known Harvard one, Conversations on Architecture of the Second Half of the 20th Century, might have some features of such a course, and Peter Eisenman's recent publication, 10 Canonical Buildings, might also. Indeed, I suppose my own Space of Appearance has some of its features, with the caveat that my book was focused more on ideas than on individual building projects. But none of these three focuses on the last 15 years. And in doing so, it seems to me that Lerner's proposal has the calculated potential to appeal to the characteristically parasitic curiosity of students in design studio more than any of the courses or publications I've just mentioned. Indeed, I might go so far as to say that Lerner's idea may have even more potential today than when he last put it to me, given that architecture students tend to read fewer books now than they did then. But before I go any further, I need to point out that my argument from here on is my own, based on my sense of that potential. So please don't hold Ralph Lerner responsible for any of the pedagogical speculations that follow. That having been said, it seems to me that some such idea as Lerner has planted in my mind points in a thought-provoking way to one of the dilemmas that our panel is asked to address. That is to say, what is the appropriate, or shall we even ask, what is the feasible pedagogical relationship of architectural history to the architecture school design studio? For me, an address to this dilemma starts with a question that must lie at the heart of any architecture school curriculum, both in studio and in non-studio courses alike. And that question, directed to students and to faculty alike, is as follows. Why is it that we think what we think about architecture? And actually, Wes's presentation at the beginning of this panel, or earlier on in this panel, made me think I might even kind of rephrase that. Why is it that we assume what we assume about architecture? But it's somewhere between assume and think, on the threshold of consciousness, shall we say. Now, before I face that question directly, bear with me while I explain a construct I informally proposed to my colleague Michael Hayes at the GSD at Harvard during my years of teaching with him there. Monica Ponce de Leon tells me Michael was supposed to be here, otherwise we might have fought this out in front of you. Let me amplify, oh yes, in my years of teaching with him there, and namely the trough of historical neglect. Now let me amplify this. It is my experience that the progress of many ideas and concepts, even many bodies of architectural production that influence design thinking in studio, has a typical and consistent historical trajectory. What is more, this trajectory is one that more or less corresponds to learners' projected 15-year time frame. In the first instance, ideas or concepts or bodies of production are viewed as radical, as cutting edge. Then, after some period of dissemination in our field, they come instead to be seen as current or as topical. From that, they then again gradually shift, this time into conventional wisdom. Then again, some short time later, a momentous bifurcation occurs in their progress. Sometimes such conventional wisdom comes under polemical attack and can even be banished from the field of architectural pedagogy altogether. In an alternate case, the wisdom in question becomes so conventional as to slip below the threshold of conscious understanding altogether into the realm of mere received opinion. As an example of the first scenario I have set out, this is the polemical attack, I would cite the banishment of the precepts of postmodernism from architecture school curricula in the late 1980s and early 1990s under attack from the enraged shock troops of Derridian deconstruction. As an example of the second, less stormy scenario, I would cite the slow dissolution of the more recent body of production that came to be known as blobs. In short, it is my view that as a result of this mysterious epistemological process, such ideas, concepts, or bodies of architectural production eventually become inaccessible to conscious ratiocination altogether. By this point, they are well and truly in the trough of historical neglect. Once they are there, of course, they lie dormant, available for rediscovery by a younger generation of researchers, though, of course, not all of them are rediscovered. Some of them are, some of those that are, do come back into shared consciousness, but this time around, they do so as history. As a case in point, I would cite the important British architect James Stirling, whose name I would venture to say is entirely unknown to students in architecture schools today. This being due to the fact that his oeuvre has remained in the trough of historical neglect up until very recently. In my view, it even remains to be seen whether the recent exhibition and conference on his work at Yale will succeed in bringing him back into the realm of conscious contemporary architectural knowledge. But of course, the whole point of such a course as Lerner hypothesized so cursorily would be to accelerate, or perhaps even to short-circuit, such a process as I have just described. If at any of the later stages of the gradual process I have described, such ideas, concepts, and bodies of production were intentionally, deliberately brought back to the forefront of studio discourse, both those being threatened with banishment and those apparently just dissolving, then it might become possible to put into question, in a pedagogically structured way, the process by which those ideas and concepts, as well as the modes of operation and bodies of work that contribute to our operative ways of designing, no less in architectural offices than in architectural school studios, come to disappear altogether from the realm of conscious rational discourse, while still governing those ways of working to some significant extent. In short, such a course might powerfully enhance our capacity to understand why it is that we think what we think about architecture. In this regard, I had not met Mark Foster Gage before this conference, and I was very taken by his opening description of himself as a recovering classical architect. So I asked him how it was he came to go to the University of Notre Dame in the first place, and he said he got a big scholarship. He came from Nebraska, and it was only in his third year at Notre Dame that he realized he was in a certain kind of school. He came to know why it was that he thought what he thought about architecture. One can imagine the revelation it must have been. In a psychological sense, this experience of coming to understand why we think what we think might have a little bit in common with the character in the play of Molière, who discovers that he has been speaking in prose his whole life without realizing that he was doing so. But there are deeper realms of potential self-realization in play here than simply the psychological one. One might, for example, speak of the modalities of mature self-awareness, which it has historically been claimed could be offered up by psychoanalysis. Certainly, much of the cultural import of the work of Freud is concerned with such processes of increased self-awareness. Or again, in an ideological sense, we could even speak in terms we owe to Michel Foucault, and here I nod to my colleague Menking, of an archaeology of knowledge. I can imagine that this process might even produce some examples of history in reverse chronological order, as in Joseph Rickwert's Adam's House in Paradise. One of the reasons that I think such a procedure might be promising is that it is one that students in design studio would be less likely to resist than they would the more conventional pedagogical process of simply narrating architecture's past, as Andrew Herscher put it in his brief. For those of the students in question that are not utter ideologues, and it is my experience that most architecture students, despite their considerable degree of unself-awareness, are not, they might as a result acquire an expanded interest even in those larger territories of architectural history beyond their own immediate studio interests, such as we speakers here in this Michigan event have found so transformative in our own academic lives. At a minimum, such students would come to understand that there is no sharp boundary line between contemporary debate and architectural history. Now, that's really the main thrust of my presentation. Is Lucia still here? Yes, she is. I'm going to skip the rest of my paper and just offer a few comments on Lucia's, and Mark Garzenbeck seems to have disappeared, and I felt a bit, oh, he's back? Excellent. I was feeling guilty about a counterattack in the absence of the victim. And the reason that I thought of Allais and Garzenbeck in this respect is that it seems to me one of the kind of great strengths of what they both did yesterday was precisely to provide us with instances of an archaeology of knowledge. Did we think, I certainly didn't think to the extent that I obviously do think, that heritage preservation carries this kind of heavy burden of consequence that was kind of articulated so effectively by the two speakers. But that having been said, I'm not entirely content. First to Lucia. the Bantam Reliance Building episode, which I noted at the time, there are a few advantages to being as old as I am, but I'd forgotten about until now. And of course, how could he have done anything else? I mean, already the kind of scrap between Bantam and myself that shows up in Meaning and Architecture, it became clear to me that he had a deep-seated resentment about architectural form, and his ideological position in architecture was the most environmental transformation you could do with the least amount of architectural form would always be the best route to go. So, of course, I mean, it would have been compromising in the extreme for him to join in the campaign to save the Reliance Building. But then I thought of a few other examples. It's really interesting. A few years later, Cedric Price, one of Bantam's children, found himself enmeshed in a controversy about a proposition to preserve the part that got built of the Fun Palace that was the idea that he helped the famous British entertainment impresario Joan Littlewood to kind of formulate and institutionalize. And here again, Price what was he going to do? His whole ideological position about architecture had been that it was a pure instrumentality which should kind of be evanescent and vanish. Except that, of course, in this case, it wasn't only his concept, it was Joan Littlewood's as well. In fact, more importantly, even hers than his. So his ability to object to the preservation of his own project was constrained by that same condition of architecture which Moneo has been so wise as to point out so many times. After we build it, the building isn't the architect's anymore. Even when they want to preserve it, you can't argue for its demolition. Now, curiously enough, Peter Collins, distinguished professor of history at McGill for many years, mentor to both Melvin Charney and Alina Payne, whom I'm sure many people in the room are aware of, argued against the preservation of the Richardsonian Romanesque City Hall in the city of Toronto after the new City Hall in the 1960s was designed and erected by Viljo Ravel from Finland. And Collins' argument was that the reason the building should not be preserved was that it wasn't the City Hall anymore. So it was a very interesting kind of backwards functionalism. Because it wasn't the City Hall anymore, then obviously there was no case for keeping it. And my most extreme example, Lewis Mumford, when I was researching monumentality in the space of appearance, I came upon this text by Mumford published in Circle, Leslie Martin magazine. I think this is from memory now, 38 or 39. And Mumford arguing that the city has to be rebuilt in every generation. It's wrong to preserve buildings. Most horrific as all, to preserve them as museums. It's Mumford sounding like Marinetti. It's a very curious thing. So when I went to sort of footnote this passage, I decided I might as well footnote it from the book which eventually came out of this, The City and History, The Culture of Cities, only discovered that the passage is not there. So somehow somebody or something got to Mumford and he decided he had gone too far. Now I'm over my time, so I'm going to have to get to the end of this. And I haven't even got to Garzenbeck next yet. What can I say? I wanted, actually, to both of them, I wanted to suggest...
We'd be happy to cede you our time.
Well, thank you. It's only you saying that. But, well, two or three more things. One, I would have thought that in the kind of attack on cultural tourism, that the name of Rem Koolhaas might have been mentioned, because I know of no more devastating passages than the ones in Whatever Happened to Urbanism and in Junk Space about those historical districts with the gas lamps and those buses that are actually sort of fake buses on truck chassis that seem to appear in every historical district in every city that has a historical district around the world, along, as he points out so accurately, with the London telephone booths, as you Americans would say, or call boxes, as they call them in London, or at least used to call them in London when they still existed there. And so, well, Cool House has eyes, as we all well know. It's a devastating critique. But the interesting thing for me is to discover, and this was also not mentioned by either of them, that his experience in Beijing caused the formidable Cool House to become a preservationist. And so some of you, I'm sure, many of you, I'm sure, know the proposition he made for downtown Beijing, that really urbanistically disagreeable place, as any of you who have been there know. So you can imagine why it caused him to become a preservationist, seeing the hutongs disappear wholesale everywhere in the center of the city. So strips. This one gets kept, the next one gets demolished and replaced. The next one gets kept, the next one gets demolished and replaced. You could almost imagine the decision being aleatory about which band is which. And it seemed to me that obviously it's a hypothesis, it doesn't quite hold water, but it seems to me it's very provocative in its capacity to elude the risk so eloquently articulated by Lucia and Mark in respect to here's that great big Marxist word, which I find indispensable still at this late stage of cultural theory, false consciousness. So if one could find a way of enabling the past to survive that did not involve its kind of turning into a kind of sort of Mr. Dress-Up kitchification, and it seemed to me the aleatory implications of the kind of Koolhausian strategy for Beijing, offer some kind of intriguing food for thought in that respect. Lastly, I just wanted to speak to the scary facticity of the disappearance of the things of the world. Pennsylvania Station in New York City all existed the first time I went to New York. But being a naive young man, I didn't realize I should have gone to see it right away, because by the next time I got there, it was gone. I'm now an old man, but I can still remember the kind of strange twinge that hit me when I realized the Taliban really were destroying the Buddhas in Afghanistan. They no longer exist. And that, for me, is kind of profound food for thought in respect to the problematics of this kind of false consciousness dilemma so articulately presented by our two colleagues. So I'm grateful to you for allowing me to go on like this. I'm grateful to them for provoking me so effectively as they did. And I thank you all for your attention to these remarks.